Hold up.
Hold up is correct because today we are doing our first chapter AP government video. No matter which book you are using, those are some of the popular ones. This video is going to help you understand the basics of US government. So let's go ahead and just start with the basics, and that is, what is government? Government is the institutions that make public policy decisions for a society. So of course you got the presidency, the legislative branch, and so on. And it's important to note that there are different levels of government. You have a federal or national government with the three branches, but each state has their own government, as does each city. Now, there are some questions raised with this basic idea of government, and that is, how should we govern? We have a democratic republic, but that is not the only form of government. And another big important question, one you're going to see constantly throughout these chapters, is what should the government do? Should they be involved in healthcare, gun control, just trying to stop global warming, and other issues? Now, in spite of your political beliefs, most people, there is general agreement that government should do the following. And one of those things is collect taxes. And that those taxes are going to be used to pay for various goods and services. And one of the most important ones, or one of the most expensive ones as well, is to provide for the national defense. The United States spends over the last few years anywhere between $600 to $700 billion a year on defense, and you can see that's much more than many other countries combined. Another task of the government is preserve the order. So if there are riots, trying to suppress those riots, and this can be done with the National Guard. Another task of the government is providing basic public goods and services. So these are things like roads, schools, post office, and the infrastructure of a nation. And finally, another task is to socialize the young. And this usually happens through schooling, training young children to be good citizens of the country. Now, politics. Now, usually when you think of politics, you probably have one of these two reactions: boredom or just disgust. But politics is extremely important. It determines who we elect as our government leaders. And usually in the media, they kind of focus on the candidates and the voters, but politics is so much more than just who you pick. Because it's also the policies the leaders pursue. What are they going to do once they get in office? And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Politics is a struggle over who gets what, when, and how. And this struggle is intense because you're dealing with what? Policies being passed. Everything from taxes to student loan debt to programs like healthcare, immigration reform, and a host of other issues. Who in the political process are, of course, citizens, political parties, candidates for office, and various other groups. The how of politics is probably the thing you most likely think of, and that is the voting for particular candidates. Politics is a participation sport, but there's other things you can do besides voting. You can lobby, you can protest, you can join interest groups, and we'll look at some of those things later on. Political participation are ways people get involved in politics. And like I mentioned, there's a lot of different ways that people can be involved. And it is more than just voting, but voting is super important. It's hella important. In fact, in the words of Puff Daddy, vote or die. Now in America, we have a problem, and that is voter apathy. If you look at this graphic, you can see we're not doing too hot when it comes to voter turnout. And so politics matter, but voter apathy is a major problem, especially amongst young people. And there's a huge disparity between those under the age of 30 and those over the age of 65 in terms of voter turnout. So let's fix this disparity. Come on, students, handle this. Vote. Now, why are older voters turning out in greater numbers? Well, the reason is they're mobilized around issues such as Social Security, around since the New Deal, and Medicare, around since Lyndon Johnson's administration. These issues directly impact them. So they are mobilized, they turn out in greater numbers around these issues. Now, single issue groups or single issue voters are people who support a candidate due to their position on a particular issue. So, for example, if a candidate is anti-abortion, they will support that candidate. They don't really care about all the other issues as long as that one issue is taken care of in their mind. They don't really care about everything else. So gun control, healthcare, these are issues that oftentimes mobilize voters around a single issue. Now, a very important thing is the policy making system. And you're probably yawning right about now because who really cares? But you should care because this is the process by which policy comes into being and evolves over time. The choices governments make or refuses to make around various issues. This is the policy making system. And it kind of can be summed up in this little graphic you got. All these different phases of the policy making system that we're going to break down right now. So hit pause if you want to look at that a little longer. So what is this policy-making system? How does it happen? Well, important to keep in mind, people shape policy. Policy-making begins with people, and important, obvious, policies impact people. These are the laws, the executive orders, the regulations, the court judgments. These influence people's lives. And really, citizens' interests are expressed through political parties, elections, interest groups, and the media. This is how we kind of get our interest and how we engage in democracy. Democracy in action is voting, political parties, interest groups, protests. This is the kind of nuts and bolts of what happens in government. Now, an important phase is you have people, but then you need linkage institutions. And that is the way people get their concerns, problems, and interests transmitted to government policymakers. And some examples of linkage institutions are political parties, elections, interest groups, and the mass media. This is how groups let the government know their policy preferences. So you have people, you have linkage institutions, and then you have a policy agenda. And linkage institutions shape the government's policy agenda. And perhaps needless to say, the policy agenda are the issues that attract the attention of public officials. This is what's on voters' minds, so they're going to address this. Now, prepare to have your mind blown. People do not always agree on what the government should do. I know, shocking. And that when that happens, and unfortunately more often than not, it then becomes a political issue. And political issue is the result of disagreement about a problem or about the public policy to fix it. Sometimes we agree there's a problem, but how do we fix it is the challenge. So after policy agenda, you have policy-making institutions. And the U.S. Constitution created 3 policy-making institutions. You have the legislative branch, which is Congress, the Senate and House, the executive branch, which is the presidency, and the judicial branch, which is the courts. And as government expanded throughout time, you have another kind of fourth, which is federal agencies, which we kind of lump together as a bureaucracy. These institutions create policy. Very few policies are made by a single policy-making institution, and that was the goal of our system of checks and balances. They need one another in order to create these policies. Now, finally, you have public policy, and of course, policies impact people. And policies must have a goal to be effective. That's oftentimes, it may be very obvious, but there's a question of effectiveness. Does the policy address the problem it was designed to solve? And policies the government makes are what we call public policy. And there's all sorts of forms of public policy, and you can see in that graphic right there, you have statutes of laws passed by Congress, you can have presidential actions, such as executive orders, or ordering a military strike against a target, you have court decisions, budgetary choices, the legislator is basically, passing budgets, who's getting funding, who's not getting funding, and regulations by various agencies, the bureaucracy, such as the Department of Ed, Department of Energy, and so on. So policies can take many forms, but the policy impacts are the effects that a policy has on people and problems in society. Now, you can't talk about U.S. government without talking about democracy. On the most basic level, it's this idea of citizens voting. People are involved in politics, government by the people. People are involved. But democracy is more than that. It is the system we use to select policymakers and the way of organizing the government. And an important thing to keep in mind is the U.S. is a representative democracy. In other words, we elect representatives to vote on policy issues. We don't all go down to D.C. and vote, but we vote for these representatives to act on our behalf. And so when people vote, people are selecting policymakers and organizing a government to reflect policy preferences of the citizenry. So what does an ideal democratic process look like? And according to traditional democratic theory, these are some key principles that democracies have. One is effective participation. Everyone has an equal chance to influence the policy agenda. All people can get involved. You have enlightened understanding, and this is really a part of, the sharing of ideas, and free speech and freedom of the press allow this to happen. Equality in voting, everyone, one person, one vote, no one group can control the policy process, and citizens' control of the agenda. You don't have any one group, and this kind of links up with equality in voting. And finally, inclusion, access to citizenship for all residents of a democratic nation. Keep in mind, this is the ideal democratic process, and this process has been challenged and tested throughout time. Now, what is important to keep in mind is the U.S. is a representative democracy. We are based upon majority rule. We elect representatives to vote on policy issues. So although we practice majority rule, there's also this goal of preserving minority rights. So democracies reflect majority rule, but the basic rights and liberties of minorities must also be protected. Now in our next video, we're going to take a look at the Founding Fathers, but fun fact about democracy, the Founding Fathers feared giving people many of the democratic rights we have today, and we'll make more sense of that a little bit later. Now some theories or forms of representative democracies. On one hand, you have participatory democracy, and this emphasizes broad participation in politics. Pluralist democracy is so various groups strive to impact political decision making, and in this system, interest groups shape and influence public policy, everything from the NRA to different labor unions. Pluralists claim no group can dominate in this system because all groups have equal access to the institutions that make decisions. So that's an important piece of that. And through this process, competition among many organized groups means that the public interest becomes public policy. That's the idea. Now, hyper-pluralist theory claims excessive influence of many competing groups leads to muddled policy and or inaction. And so basically this is pluralism gone bad. Government sucks because too many groups are trying to influence policymakers, and politicians are trying to make every group happy, so nobody becomes happy and nothing gets done. It leads to gridlock and government can't function. Now, elite democratic theory basically states decisions are made by elected representatives that act as trustees of the public good. Elitism says that not all groups have equal access. The wealthy have more power, and there's a class theory that contends the upper class elites control the government. The wealthy, the rich, they have way more power and they're able to shape policy as a result. So these are different kind of ideas about democracy or forms that democracy can take, and we'll explore these a little bit later. Now, you all know Americans are diverse, but in spite of that diversity, there is elements of American political culture and democracy, an overall set of values shared within American society. And these are kind of some of the ones that you're going to see throughout this course. Liberty or freedom and belief in limited government, whether it be freedom of speech, freedom of religion, that's a big part of American values, and you'll oftentimes hear about this. But there's a complexity. How much freedom, how much privacy, these freedoms and liberties are tested. Egalitarianism. There's an equality of opportunity. There is no class distinctions, formal class distinctions such as titles of nobility. And so this is a big part of American life. But once again, this issue is also extremely complex because Americans have never been equal in terms of condition. Factors such as race and gender have played a huge role, but there still is this idea of egalitarianism. Individualism. Everybody can get ahead on their own. All these different immigrants, migrations, whether it be internal migration, Western expansion. If you remember from American history, Frederick Jackson Turner talking about the frontier, external migration, immigrants coming from all over the world. There is this idea that the American dream, you can make it if you try hard. Another element of American political culture is laissez-faire or free enterprise. There is a general support for free markets and limited or weak federal government. And this is strongly connected to individualism. And like all these things, there is a complexity here, right? Because there is support for entitlement programs and a social safety net and basic regulations to protect the environment or other issues. So that'll come up frequently. Another element is the rule of law. All people and institutions are subject to laws that are fairly applied and equally enforced. And then finally, populism. You're going to see this over and over again, supporting the rights of average citizens against privileged elites. You could see that during the campaign of Bernie Sanders in 2016, and the campaign of William Jennings Bryan during the Populist Party in the 1890s. So this idea of the everyday average American. So what about government life today, right? And so there is a continued debate about the proper scope and role of government in modern America. How big should the government be? What should the government do? What is the balance between governmental power and individual rights? But it's important to keep in mind, government does play a huge role in modern society. The government spends 1/3 of the GDP, the gross domestic product, employs millions of people, and is addressing a variety of issues that the founding fathers probably didn't really think too much about because it wasn't a reality. Everything from terrorism to immigration, energy, education, the environment, employment, healthcare. And there is continued debate as to whether or not the government should address some of those issues. And there are many challenges to democracy. One, we've already addressed, the lack of civic participation, especially amongst young people. Come on, handle this. And there's a complexity of issues. You know, there's so many different things like terrorism, net neutrality, immigration, energy, global warming. There's a feeling that you need these elite experts to kind of really understand these complicated problems, and many people get turned off the complexity of things. The impact of money is a major challenge, especially with the Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. This is a court case we'll learn about a little bit later, but basically allowed political spending by corporations, unions, and other associations. It would be a form of protected speech. In other words, campaign spending is going to dramatically increase. You're going to see the formation of PACs, political action committees, spending huge amounts of money. And there is a diverse political interest, which oftentimes leads to policy gridlock. You have so many different interest groups trying to influence things, nothing can get done. And with this comes a sharp polarization of American politics. We are deeply divided today in American life. You have debates between liberals versus conservatives, Democrats versus Republicans. You have the so-called culture wars, where some are claiming that we're losing our traditional values like religion and family, and issues like abortion and gay marriage and so on are dividing many Americans. And the role of the mass media. You have the proliferation of ideological oriented programs. People watch programs that reinforce their existing political views. So you have a huge mass media, and then you have, of course, this fake news, media bias, fake news websites, and the fact that the media is owned by a few corporations. These are some of the themes that we are going to be looking at this year in AP Government. Thank you very much for watching, and if you haven't already done so, subscribe to Jocz Productions. Have a beautiful day. Peace.